The blood had dried between pages 214 and 215. Grace Miller said it aloud because the old bookstore was empty, and empty rooms sometimes made silence feel less honest. Rain tapped against the narrow windows of the Lantern and Quill. The sound moved softly through shelves crowded with cracked leather spines, loose parchment, and books repaired so many times that thread had become part of their history. Grace stood behind the oak counter holding a volume of Northern hymns. It had been returned before dawn. No note. No payment. Only the book wrapped in wet brown cloth and left beneath the iron sign outside. At first, she had assumed the stain between the pages was ink. Then she touched it. Too dark. Too uneven. Blood. Not much. Enough to mark the paper and leave the faint metallic smell beneath dust and beeswax. Grace closed the book carefully. People often believed booksellers noticed only words. They were wrong. Grace noticed torn stitching, damp corners, missing pages, fingerprints pressed into old glue. A book always carried evidence of the hands that had held it. This one carried fear. She turned toward the rear of the shop. A muddy footprint marked the floor near the history shelves. Small, the size of a child's boot. Another appeared beside the narrow staircase leading to the storage loft. Grace set the book down. Martha. No answer came from the back room. Martha Collins had left earlier to buy lamp oil before the market filled. Grace was alone. She moved between the shelves without lifting her skirt, careful not to let the fabric brush the stacked books near the floor. The first step creaked beneath her weight. The second did not. At the top, she found another drop of blood on the wooden rail, fresh enough to shine. Grace's pulse quickened. She followed the trail through the storage room, past crates of damaged manuscripts and an old printing press her father had never managed to repair. The rear door stood slightly open. Cold rain breathed through the gap. Beyond it, in the narrow alley behind the shop, someone was crouched beneath the stone steps. A boy, 8 years old, perhaps. His dark cloak was torn along one shoulder. Mud covered his boots and knees. One hand pressed against a bleeding cut beneath his ribs. The other held a small wooden wolf against his chest. He looked at Grace with gray-blue eyes that were far too controlled for a frightened child. "Do not call the guards," he said. His voice broke on the final word. Grace lowered herself slowly, leaving several feet between them. "I was not going to. You should. Would that help you?" The boy's grip tightened around the wolf. No, rainwater ran from his hair across his pale face. He tried to breathe quietly, but each breath ended in a dry, painful cough. Grace smelled something sharp beneath the wet wool. Silver smoke. She had encountered it once before when a damaged military ledger arrived from the northern barracks. The pages had carried the same bitter metallic scent. "Who did this to you?" she asked. The boy glanced toward the mouth of the alley. "Men wearing my father's crest." Before Grace could ask what crest he meant, heavy fists struck the bookstore's front door. Once, twice, 3 times. A man shouted from the street. "Royal Guard. Open in the king's name." The boy went completely still. Not relieved. Terrified. Grace looked at the wooden wolf in his hand. A crown had been carved beneath its paws. Then the front door shook beneath another blow. The men outside wore the correct crest. That was what made them dangerous. Grace saw the silver wolf through the narrow front window as she moved back into the shop. 3 figures stood beneath the rain, dark cloaks hanging from broad shoulders, iron buckles catching the weak morning light. Royal Guard. At least, that was what the uniforms said. The boy followed several steps behind her, one hand pressed against his side. "Can you walk?" Grace asked. He nodded too quickly. That meant no. The front door shook again. Open immediately. Grace looked at the men more carefully. Her father had repaired military records for years. Soldiers often brought damaged ledgers into the shop, and Grace had learned details without meaning to. Royal Guards fastened their cloaks on the left, so the right arm remained free for a sword. These men had buckled theirs on the right. One wore his insignia too low. Another carried a palace blade, but stood with the weight of a hired street fighter. The symbols were correct. The men inside them were not. Grace turned the lock halfway, enough to make it sound as though she were struggling with the old mechanism. One moment, she lowered her voice. "What is your name?" The boy hesitated. "Eli. Eli, I need you to trust me for the next minute." His gray-blue eyes searched her face. "Why?" "Because those men are wearing the king's crest incorrectly." Something in him loosened. Not relief. Recognition. Grace took his hand and led him between the shelves. At the rear of the shop stood a tall bookcase filled with histories no one had purchased in years. She pressed the carved brass rose hidden beneath the third shelf. The case shifted with a groan. A narrow room appeared behind it. Her father had built it to protect rare manuscripts from fires and thieves. Inside were a small table, blankets, an oil lamp, and a ventilation shaft leading toward the roof. Eli stared into the darkness. "You hide people here?" "Mostly books." "That is not what I asked." Grace almost smiled. "Today, I am making an exception." Another impact struck the front door. Wood cracked near the lock. Grace guided Eli inside, then knelt beside him. His breathing had become rougher. Silver smoke did not only weaken wolves. It burned the lungs, tightened the chest, and made panic feel like drowning. She opened a small wooden box beneath the table and removed dried mint, pine needles, and bitterroot. "My mother taught me this," she said, crushing the herbs into a cup. "It will not cure silver exposure, but the steam may help you breathe." Eli watched her pour hot water from the kettle. "You do not know who I am." "No, you do not know who my father is." "No, then why are you helping me?" Grace placed the cup near his face and waited until he inhaled the steam. "Because you asked me not to call the guards." The front door splintered. Eli grabbed her wrist. "If they find me, they will not." He looked down at the wooden wolf in his hand. Then he pressed it into her palm. "Keep this." Grace felt the small carved crown beneath its paws. "If they take me," he whispered, "do not give it back to them." Before she could answer, the shop door crashed open. Boots entered. Grace closed the bookcase and stepped away just as 3 false guards emerged between the shelves. The tallest man placed a folded letter on her counter. Black wax sealed it with the emblem of the Lantern Quill. Her own seal. Except Grace had never written the letter. The man smiled. "You should have opened the door sooner." The Alpha King arrived with evidence in his hand. Grace heard the street fall silent before she saw him. The false guards had been gone for less than an hour. They had searched the shop without opening the hidden room, overturned 2 tables, and left the sealed letter where it could not be missed. Then the noise outside changed. Market voices disappeared. Shutters closed. Horses stopped beneath the iron sign. The silence moved toward the Lantern Quill with the weight of authority. Grace stood behind the damaged counter, one hand resting near the wooden wolf hidden beneath her apron. Eli remained behind the rotating bookcase, breathing through the herbal steam as quietly as he could. The front door opened. Alpha King William Blackwood entered first. He was taller than Grace had imagined, broad enough that the doorway seemed built for smaller men. Rain darkened the shoulders of his black wolfskin cloak. Beneath it, fitted leather armor crossed a powerful frame, and a silver emblem rested at his throat. The same crowned wolf carved beneath Eli's wooden toy. William's face was controlled. His eyes were not. They searched every shelf, doorway, and shadow with the focus of a man holding terror so tightly it had become anger. Beta Robert Kane entered beside him. Older, calm, gray beginning at his temples. He carried the false letter. "Grace Miller?" Robert asked. "Yes." He unfolded the parchment. "This was delivered to the palace an hour ago." Grace recognized her shop seal pressed into the black wax. The handwriting was not hers. The message demanded gold in exchange for the safe return of the Alpha King's son. William stepped closer. "Where is Eli?" Grace's heart struck once against her ribs. She understood then. The frightened child behind her wall was the heir to 5 territories. "I found a boy injured behind the shop." William's expression sharpened. Robert spoke before she could continue. "You admit he is here." The men chasing him wore royal guard uniforms. A faint sound came from behind the bookcase. A cough. William turned toward it instantly. Grace moved between him and the hidden release. "Their uniforms were wrong," she said. "The cloak fastenings were reversed. They carried your crest, but they were not your men." Robert's voice remained smooth. "A bookseller is accusing the royal guard to hide her crime. I am accusing 3 men who broke into my shop and planted that letter." Robert placed the parchment on the counter. "The wax bears your seal. My father's seal was copied years ago from merchant records." "How convenient." William's hands curled at his sides. "Open the wall." Grace looked at the guards behind him. 8 men. Real uniforms this time. Or uniforms worn correctly. She could no longer tell which difference mattered. "I will open it when the men who hunted him are identified." The room became colder. William stepped forward. "My son is injured behind that wall." Yes. And you are refusing to return him. I am refusing to hand him to someone he told me to fear. Pain crossed William's face so quickly Grace almost missed it. Robert did not. My king, he said quietly. She is delaying because she knows what we will find. Eli coughed again. Harder. William placed one hand against the tall bookcase. Wood creaked beneath his palm. Grace stood her ground. The room is hidden behind a supporting wall, she warned. If you tear it open carelessly, the upper beams may shift. William looked at her. There was fear beneath his anger now. Fear for the child breathing badly only a few feet away. Move, he said. Grace did not. Robert watched from behind the king, calm enough to be certain of what would happen next. William's fingers closed around the edge of the bookcase. Move, he repeated, or I will move the building around you. The first shelf fell without warning. William tore it from the wall with one violent pull. Oak split from stone. Books struck the floor in a wave of leather, paper, and dust. A glass ink bottle shattered beneath the weight, spreading black across a stack of restored maps. Grace moved toward him. Stop. He reached for the second shelf. You are weakening the wall. My son is behind it, and the roof is above him. William's face changed at the word son, but not enough. Fear had already taken control. It moved through him as strength. The second bookcase came away harder. One iron bracket snapped. Another tore loose from the mortar with a sound like bone breaking. Guards stepped back. No one tried to stop their king. Robert Kane stood near the counter, watching with careful stillness. Grace saw it. Not concern. Expectation. He wanted the shop destroyed. William, she said. The use of his name struck the room harder than shouting would have. His head turned. Grace pointed toward the ceiling. A thin crack had opened across the plaster beam above the hidden room. Pull again, and that comes down. Eli coughed behind the wall. William looked toward the sound. Then he drove one shoulder into the remaining frame. The rotating case tore free. Wood collapsed inward. The hidden door broke open. A storm of loose pages burst into the room, lifted by displaced air. Old letters, unfinished bindings, and notes written in her father's hand spun between the shelves before settling beneath boots. Grace stood frozen. The room her father had built was gone. So was the wall that had protected it. Eli appeared in the opening. Pale, barefoot, one hand pressed against his ribs. For one heartbeat, William did not move. Then he crossed the ruined floor. Eli. The boy flinched. Not away from the king. Toward Grace. He stepped in front of her. William stopped. The entire shop became silent. Eli's wooden wolf remained hidden beneath Grace's apron. His empty hand shook at his side, but his voice did not. She saved me. William stared at him. Eli pointed toward Robert. His men chased me. Robert's expression did not change. The boy continued. They wore a crest. They pushed my horse into the river. She pulled me out. Grace looked at William. The rage had left his face. What remained was worse. Understanding. He saw the broken shelves. The manuscripts crushed beneath armored boots. The ceiling beam sagging above them. The woman whose home he had destroyed because she had refused to surrender his son to men she did not trust. Robert stepped forward. The child is confused. I am not, Eli said. Robert's eyes hardened. Only slightly. Enough. Grace saw his hand move beneath his cloak. Not toward his sword. Toward the window. Down, she shouted. The glass exploded inward. A silver bolt crossed the shop. Grace seized Eli and pulled him behind the heavy oak printing table. The bolt struck the wall where his chest had been. William turned toward the street with a roar that shook dust from the rafters. Guards rushed outside. Robert moved with them. Too quickly. By the time William reached the broken window, the shooter had vanished into the rain. So had his beta. Grace remained on the floor with Eli beneath her arms. Above them, the damaged beam gave a low, splintering groan. William looked back. At his son. At Grace. At the ruin he had created. Then the ceiling began to fall. The ceiling came down in pieces. Not the entire roof. Only enough to kill anyone beneath it. William crossed the ruined shop before the first beam struck the floor. He reached Grace and Eli in 3 strides, bent over them, and took the falling wood across his shoulders. The impact drove him to one knee. Dust filled the room. A second beam crashed against the printing table. Stone fragments scattered across the floor. Somewhere near the front window, glass continued to fall in small, delicate pieces that sounded almost gentle. Grace covered Eli's head. William covered both of them. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the damaged ceiling settled. "Are you hurt?" William asked. His voice was rough beneath the dust. Grace looked at Eli first. The boy was shaking, but alive. "No." William pushed the broken beam aside and rose. Blood darkened the fabric near his shoulder where a nail had torn through his cloak, but he did not look at it. The guards returned through the shattered doorway. "No sign of the shooter," one said. "Kane is missing." William's expression became still. That was how Grace understood the anger had returned. Not wild this time. Directed. "Seal the gates," he ordered. "No royal uniform leaves the district without inspection." The guards disappeared again. Eli remained pressed against Grace. William held out his hand. "Come with me." The boy did not take it. His fingers closed around Grace's sleeve instead. William saw. Something in his face changed. Not jealousy. Recognition. His son trusted the woman whose home he had destroyed more than he trusted the men wearing his crest. Grace stood slowly. The bookstore looked smaller now. Rain entered through the broken window. Water darkened fallen pages. Her father's letters lay beneath pieces of plaster and oak. A restored atlas she had spent 6 weeks repairing had split along its spine. She knelt and began gathering the pages. One at a time. "Leave them," William said. "The building is unsafe. They will be ruined by the rain. I will replace them." Grace stopped. She looked up at him. "You cannot replace a note written in my father's hand." William said nothing. She lifted another page from beneath a broken shelf. "You cannot replace the first book my mother gave me, or the records customers trusted me to protect, or the years it took to repair what you destroyed in minutes." His jaw tightened. "I was wrong." Grace looked around the shop. Black ink spread across the floor like a shadow beneath the books. "You were powerful," she said. That made being wrong more expensive. The words struck him harder than anger would have. William lowered his eyes. The Alpha King who had commanded armies stood in the wreckage without an answer. Eli moved beside Grace and began collecting pages too. William watched his son kneel among the broken books. Then he removed his cloak and spread it across the driest part of the floor. "Put what can be saved here," he said. Grace studied him. It was not an apology. Not enough. But it was the first useful thing he had done since entering her shop. Together, they gathered what remained. When the final guard returned, William ordered wagons brought for every surviving book, ledger, printing tool, and fragment of furniture. Grace turned sharply. "Where are you taking them?" "To the castle archives." "No," William paused. "They will be dry there. They stay with me." Eli stepped between them. "Then she comes too." William looked at his son. The boy held a torn page in one hand and Grace's sleeve in the other. "I am not leaving her," Eli said. The decision settled before William could make it. Grace looked once more at the ruined shop. Then she picked up her father's blood-stained book and held it against her chest. "Only until the building is safe," she said. William nodded. This time, he did not command. He asked, "Will you come?" Grace met his eyes. For Eli. William accepted the answer. Outside, royal wagons waited in the rain. Behind them, the lantern and quill stood broken but not empty. Not yet. The ransom letter had been sewn with military thread. Grace noticed it before she read the first line. The castle archive was warmer than the lantern and quill had ever been. Braziers burned at both ends of the chamber. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, filled with ledgers protected by iron clasps and royal seals. Her surviving books occupied 3 long tables beneath the windows, each separated by dry cloth and weighted flat to prevent the damp pages from curling. William had assigned 12 servants to help. Grace trusted none of them with the letter. She stood beneath a hanging lamp while Eli slept in a chair nearby, wrapped in a wool blanket with the wooden wolf returned to his hands. William remained across the table. He had removed his armor, but not the tension from his shoulders. "Your seal is on the wax," he said. "A copy of it." Grace turned the folded parchment beneath the light. The stitches along one edge were black. Ordinary merchants used linen thread. Bookbinders used waxed flax. This thread was thicker, twisted with a narrow red strand, and treated against rain. Military dispatch thread. She cut one stitch with a repair knife. Fine dark grains fell onto the table. William leaned closer. "Sand." Grace rubbed it between her fingers. "Black grit from the Western Armory Yard. It gets into the wax stores because the military seals are kept near the forge." His expression hardened. The ransom letter had not come from her bookstore. It had come from somewhere inside his own defenses. Grace examined the handwriting next. The letters were deliberately uneven, as though someone had tried to imitate the uncertain hand of an uneducated shopkeeper. But the ink pressure remained consistent. Each line began farther to the right than the one above it. Not carelessness, a pattern. She copied the first letter of every line onto a blank page. D-E-S-T-R-O-Y. William watched the word form. Grace continued. The lantern before the archive is found. The room became very quiet. Eli shifted beneath the blanket, but did not wake. William read the message twice. Robert wanted the shop destroyed. He wanted you to destroy it. Grace turned the ransom letter over. Tiny marks had been pressed into the lower margin. Dots, hooks, and short lines almost hidden beneath the texture of the parchment. Her father's system. He had used similar symbols when cataloging altered royal documents. One mark for copied seals, another for replaced pages, a third for records removed from their original location. Grace traced the pattern. This refers to an archive beneath the lantern. William looked at her. You knew there was an archive? No. She thought of the old printing table. The stone floor beneath it. The brass rows controlling the hidden reading room. Her father had built mechanisms everywhere. She had assumed they protected books. Perhaps they protected something else. William placed both hands against the table. Robert knew what was beneath your shop. He knew enough to fear it. And when Eli escaped, he used my anger to erase the evidence. Grace looked at him. He did not look away. The truth stood between them without mercy. Robert had created the lie. William had provided the destruction. Eli opened his eyes. Is my bookstore gone? He asked sleepily. Grace turned toward him. It is not your bookstore. It could be. William looked at the boy, then at the damaged books spread across the tables. What do we need to find the archive? Grace folded the letter carefully. The bookstore still has one wall standing. That is not what I asked. She met his eyes. For the first time since he entered the Lantern Quill, there was no command in his voice. Only readiness. Grace picked up the blood-stained volume from the first table. Between pages 214 and 215, beneath the dried blood, a line of her father's handwriting had begun to appear as the paper warmed. The lantern opens only for the wolf who carries the crown. Grace looked at William's signet ring, then at Eli's wooden wolf. The shop was waiting for both of you, she said. The stone beneath the printing table had no keyhole. Grace found that strange. Everything her father built had required a mechanism, a brass rose, a hidden latch, a sequence of pressure points disguised beneath carved wood. But the square slab beneath the ruined press was smooth except for one shallow impression near its center. A crowned wolf. Rain moved through the broken roof of the Lantern Quill, striking fallen shelves and darkening the ash left by the collapsed ceiling. William stood beside Grace with 4 trusted guards positioned outside the shop. Eli remained between them, holding the wooden wolf against his chest. The ruins smelled of wet paper, stone dust, and smoke. Grace knelt beside the impression. Your ring. William removed the Blackwood signet from his finger. He did not place it into the stone immediately. What happens when I do? If my father left instructions, the floor opens. And if Robert left the instructions? Grace looked at the damaged walls. Then we are already standing where he wanted us dead. William lowered himself beside her. I will do it. Grace took the ring from his hand. No, his expression hardened. This is not the time to argue over pride. It is not pride. She pointed toward the brass hinge barely visible beneath the printing press. The person using the seal must stand to the side. The center stone may drop. William studied the mechanism. Then he moved where she indicated. Grace pressed the signet into the wolf-shaped mark. Something shifted beneath the floor. Not loudly. A low, ancient movement of stone against stone. The slab sank half an inch, then slid beneath the wall. Cold air rose from below. A staircase descended into darkness. Eli stepped closer. My mother knew about this. Grace looked at the wooden wolf in his hands. Someone in your family did. William lit a torch and entered first. Grace followed with Eli behind her, one hand gripping the back of her cloak. The hidden archive lay beneath the bookstore foundations. Shelves carved directly into stone lined the chamber. Hundreds of sealed ledgers rested inside waxed leather covers. Maps hung from iron rods. Wooden boxes bore the insignias of packs Grace recognized, and several she did not. Her father had not hidden books. He had hidden history. William opened the nearest ledger. Names filled every page. Missing children. Pups taken from border villages over 7 years. Beside each name appeared a payment, a guard route, and the seal of Robert Kane. Eli stopped breathing for a moment. He did this before me. Grace turned another page. 5 pups had been returned after their fathers agreed to support new military laws. 3 had never returned. Robert had not been kidnapping children for ransom. He had been using them to control packs. William's hand tightened around the ledger. The leather cover creaked beneath his fingers. Grace found a bundle of forged guard orders tied with military thread. Another box contained copied royal seals. Beneath them lay a map of silver routes crossing the northern territories. Every betrayal connected to the palace. Every order carried authority stolen from William's name. A heavy sound came from above. The stone entrance closed. Eli looked toward the staircase. "Father." Smoke began to curl through the ventilation shaft. Not gray. Black. Grace smelled lamp oil. Robert had followed them. William drew his sword. Grace looked around the archive. No second door. No visible window. Only shelves, parchment, iron rods, and a narrow channel near the ceiling. "The shop is burning," William said. Grace touched the stone wall. "No." She listened to the faint pull of air behind it. "He is burning the evidence." The smoke thickened. Eli coughed. Grace looked toward the old wooden press mechanism built into the archive wall. Then she understood why her father had hidden it below. Not to print books. To move stone. She seized the iron crank. "Help me turn this," she said. William stepped beside her. Above them, fire crossed the ruins of the home he had already destroyed once. This time, Grace intended to save what remained. The iron crank did not move. William gripped it with both hands. Muscles tightened beneath his black tunic, but the mechanism answered only with a dry metallic groan. Smoke thickened around them. Eli coughed into his sleeve. Grace lowered the torch and examined the press built into the wall. Its wooden frame had warped with age, but the iron spindle remained intact. A rope disappeared through a stone channel above it. Her father had never designed a door without considering fire. Books feared flame more than thieves. "There must be a ventilation passage," she said. William looked toward the ceiling. Large enough for a child, large enough for parchment crates. She followed the rope behind the shelves and found a rusted locking pin concealed beneath a ledger ledge. It had been painted the same gray as the stone. Grace pulled. Nothing happened. She wrapped both hands around it and pulled again. The pin tore free. The press released with sudden force. William caught the crank before it struck her. Together, they turned it. The rope tightened overhead, drawing hidden weights through the wall. Stone scraped somewhere beyond the shelves. A narrow section opened, revealing a sloping tunnel filled with cold air. Eli inhaled sharply. Grace gathered the ledgers, forged orders, and copied seals into a leather document chest. "You take him," William said. Grace looked at him. "And you?" "Robert will be waiting above." The entrance stair shook beneath a heavy impact. Someone was forcing it open. William drew his sword. Grace understood. He was not staying because he believed himself invincible. He was staying because the tunnel was too narrow for them to fight and escape together. She handed Eli the wooden wolf. "Follow the air," she told him. "Do not stop until you see light." "I will not leave, Father." William knelt before his son. "You are not leaving me. You are carrying the truth." Eli's mouth tightened, but he nodded. Grace pushed the chest ahead of them and entered the tunnel. Behind her, stone cracked. Robert's voice entered the archive. "You should have let the books burn." William answered quietly. "You should never have touched my son." Steel struck steel. Grace kept moving. The tunnel descended beneath the old district before rising toward the abandoned chapel beside the city wall. Smoke followed for several yards, then weakened as clean air pulled through the passage. They reached an iron grate beneath the chapel floor. Grace used the printing spindle as a lever. The grate lifted. Eli climbed through first. Grace pushed the evidence chest after him. Then a hand closed around the boy's collar. Robert Kane stood above them. Blood marked one side of his face, but his sword remained steady. He dragged Eli against his chest and pressed the blade near the child's throat. William emerged from the tunnel behind Grace. He had lost his cloak. A cut crossed his forearm. Robert smiled. "One step, my king, and the air dies." Eli trembled. Grace looked at the wooden wolf in his hand. During the night in the bookstore, she had taught him one simple signal. When the wolf falls, Lower your head. Grace reached for the evidence chest as though surrendering it. Then she let her fingers strike Eli's hand. The wooden wolf dropped. Eli ducked. William moved. He crossed the chapel before Robert could adjust his blade. One hand seized Robert's wrist. The other drove him against the stone pillar. The sword fell harmlessly across the floor. Robert collapsed beneath William's grip. Grace pulled Eli away and held him until his breathing slowed. William stood over the man who had worn his trust for years. Behind them, smoke rose above the burning bookstore. But the ledgers were safe. The child was alive. And this time, the truth had escaped the fire. A king's apology means nothing if the ruins remain. Grace's voice carried through the great hall without trembling. 3 days had passed since the fire. Robert Kane stood in chains beneath the Blackwood crest. His ceremonial cloak had been removed, leaving him dressed in a plain gray tunic. Lords from 5 territories filled the stone chamber, while guards lined the walls with their cloak clasps fastened correctly on the left. The evidence rested on a long oak table. Forged military orders, copied royal seals, ledgers containing the names of missing pups, the ransom letter sewn with thread from the Western Armory. William sat upon the throne, but he did not look like a man protected by it. He looked like a father who had finally seen how often his authority had been used to frighten innocent people. Grace stood beside Eli. The boy held his wooden wolf in both hands. Robert lifted his chin. A bookseller found old papers beneath her shop. That proves nothing. Grace opened the largest ledger. Your payments were recorded beside every altered guard route. Anyone could have written my name. The wax contains black sand from the military forge. Then a soldier betrayed the crown. William rose. The room quieted instantly. My son heard your men give the order to force his horse into the river. Robert's expression shifted. Only for a moment. It was enough. Eli stepped forward. You told them I had to disappear until my father declared war on the northern packs. Several lords turned toward one another. Robert looked at the child with cold disbelief. You were choking on silver smoke. You remember nothing clearly. I remember Grace pulling me from the water. Eli's voice strengthened. I remember your man asking whether the river had finished the work. Robert pulled once against his chains. They are lying. Grace placed the copied seals beside William's true signet. Then she laid her father's catalog markings beside the forged documents. My father discovered the first altered orders 7 years ago, she said. He hid copies beneath the Lantern Quill because someone inside the palace was erasing the originals. William looked toward the assembled council. Robert Kane ordered the abduction of children to control their families. He used my crest, my guards, and my trust. Robert's calm finally broke. I kept your territories obedient. You made them afraid. Fear is obedience. No, William said. Fear is what allowed me to mistake violence for action. His gaze moved to Grace. The hall followed it. William descended from the throne. He stopped before her, not as close as a king accustomed to taking space might have stood. Grace Miller saved my son without knowing his name. She protected him from men wearing my crest. I answered her courage by destroying her home before hearing her warning. No one moved. Kings confessed victories in great halls. They did not confess shame. William continued. Robert created the lie. I chose what I did with it. Grace felt Eli's hand find hers. William faced the council. Robert Kane is stripped of rank, title, land, and command. His records will be opened to every family named in those ledgers. The missing will be searched for until each child is found or each family receives the truth. Guards led Robert away. He did not look at William. He looked at Grace, as though the quiet bookseller had become more dangerous than the king. When the doors closed, William returned to the evidence table. Tell me what can be repaired, he said. Grace thought of wet pages beneath broken beams. Her father's handwriting darkened by rain. Children who had once stood outside her windows because they could not afford to enter. The books, she said. The building. And the law that allowed one frightened king to destroy a woman's life before she was permitted to finish speaking. William nodded. All 3. The Lantern Quill was rebuilt before winter. The surviving stones formed its foundation. New oak shells were carved from trees on Blackwood land. Royal archivists worked beneath Grace's direction, restoring every page that fire and rain had spared. A public reading room occupied the brightest corner. No child paid to enter. Above the door, a new law was carved into stone. No warning shall be dismissed because of the speaker's rank. Grace accepted the title of Royal Keeper of Records, but she refused rooms inside the castle. Her place remained among the shelves. On the morning the bookstore reopened, Eli placed his wooden wolf upon the first completed bookcase. William stood near the doorway without guards or armor. "May I return tomorrow?" he asked. Grace adjusted a repaired volume on the shelf. As a king, he looked around at the walls he had once broken. As a man who still has much to rebuild, Grace studied him for a long moment. Then she opened the book beside her and pointed toward an empty chair. "You may begin today." William returned the next morning without a crown. Grace noticed that first. The second thing she noticed was the book beneath his arm. It was a damaged history of Blackwood law, its leather cover split near the spine and 3 pages folded at the corners. "You brought work," she said. "I was told this was a place for repairing what had been mishandled." Grace looked at him. William did not smile. Not because he lacked humor, because he understood the sentence belonged to more than the book. Eli entered behind him carrying a basket of warm bread. 2 guards remained outside, far enough from the windows that the children already reading near the hearth did not become silent. That had been Grace's first rule. No armed men inside the public room unless danger was present. William had accepted it without argument. He placed the damaged volume on her work table. "My grandfather wrote notes in the margins," he said. "The archivist wanted to replace the entire binding. And you refused? I am beginning to understand that replacing something is not the same as preserving it." Grace opened the cover carefully. The stitching had loosened, but the paper remained strong. She showed Eli how to support the spine while turning the pages. William washed her hands. They were small compared with his. Ink marked 2 fingers. A pale burn crossed one wrist from the night beneath the bookstore. He had seen warriors carry scars with pride. Grace carried hers without display. A maid from the castle entered near midday. She stopped at the threshold, clutching a folded kitchen ledger. Her name was Nora Bell. Grace remembered her from the archive wagons. "I was told warnings could be brought here," Nora said. "They can," Grace replied. Nora glanced toward William and lowered her eyes. His presence had made the room smaller again. William saw it. He moved away from the work table and sat beside the children near the hearth. Not upon the carved chair prepared for him. Upon a plain wooden bench. Nora approached Grace. "The flower deliveries are wrong," she whispered. 3 sacks carry the miller's mark, but the stitching is military thread. Grace became still. William looked up. He did not interrupt. Nora continued. "The steward told me servants should not question seals." Grace opened the ledger. The numbers showed twice as much flour entering the castle as the kitchens had received. Not poison. Not assassins. Theft. Still dangerous. Hungry soldiers became angry soldiers, and angry soldiers were easy to purchase. Grace handed the ledger to William. He read it, then looked at Nora. "You noticed what my officials did not." Nora braced herself as though expecting punishment. William rose. "The steward will answer before the council. You will not." Her eyes lifted. "Your Majesty, you brought a warning. That is not a crime." After she left, William remained near the door. "One law carved in stone is not enough," Grace said. "No, people must believe it." "Yes. And belief takes repetition." William looked toward the children, the repaired shelves, and the chair Grace had not yet invited him to use. "Then we repeat it until fear becomes the unusual thing." That evening, he stayed after the lamps were lit. Grace repaired his grandfather's book while he read merchant petitions aloud to Eli. When she finished, she placed the restored volume before him. William touched the repaired spine. "It will hold," she said. "For how long?" "That depends on how carefully it is handled." His eyes met hers. Grace knew he understood. William lifted the book with both hands. This time, he treated it as though strength meant knowing how not to break what mattered. The mud on the laundry girl's hem did not belong inside the castle. Grace noticed it when the girl entered the Lantern and Quill just before closing. Snow had begun falling beyond the windows. The reading room was empty except for Eli, asleep beside the hearth with a book open across his chest, and William, who sat at the repair table copying damaged council records by hand. The girl stopped near the door. Her name was Hannah Cole, 16, quiet, usually invisible to anyone carrying a title. "I was told warnings could be brought here," she said. Grace set down her binding needle. "They can." Hannah glanced toward William. He placed his pen aside but remained seated. What did you see? Grace asked. A man leaving the western map room. Was he a guard? He wore a guard's cloak. Grace waited. Hannah rubbed her thumb against the mud dried on her apron. But the mud on his boots was red. William straightened. The castle courtyard was covered in gray winter clay. Red soil came from the southern road beyond the sealed city gate. The western map room holds border routes, William said. Hannah lowered her eyes. I told the captain. He said laundry girls should not invent spies. William's expression hardened. Grace touched the small brass bell beside her work table. 2 trusted guards entered from the street. William gave the order calmly. Seal the western tower. Bring Captain Harris to the council chamber. No one burns, removes, or replaces a map. The guards left. Hannah remained still. Am I in trouble? She asked. No, William said. You may have prevented one. An hour later, they found the missing border map beneath a coal cart. The disguised guard carried messages proving that Robert Kane's remaining allies planned to sell an unprotected mountain route to a rival pack. Hannah's warning stopped them before they reached the gate. When William returned to the bookstore, snow covered his shoulders. Grace was placing Eli's blanket more securely around him. Hannah has been appointed to the castle inspection staff, William said. Grace looked up. She is 16. She sees what trained officers ignore. A small smile touched Grace's face. Months earlier, William might have mistaken that smile for forgiveness. Now he understood it was approval, and that it had to be earned separately each time. He removed his cloak and stood near the repaired shelves. I have commanded armies without fear, he said. Yet I have spent 3 weeks trying to say one sentence to you. Grace's hands became still. William looked toward Eli, then back at her. I did not begin loving you because you saved my son. The room seemed to quiet around them. I began because you refused to let power decide what was true. Because you rebuilt a place I had broken and made it safer for people who had no voice. Because every time I entered this room, you expected me to become better instead of pretending I already was. Grace studied his face. There was no command in it. No expectation. Only a man offering the truth and leaving her free to close the door. I love you, Grace Miller, he said. You owe me nothing for saying it. She crossed the distance between them slowly. Good, she replied. Because love paid as a debt becomes another kind of prison. William nodded. I know. Grace touched the repaired seam of his grandfather's book lying on the table. You have learned patience. I am still learning. And how not to break what matters. His voice lowered. Every day. Grace lifted her hand to his face. Then she kissed him. Not because he was the Alpha King. Not because fate had named them mates. Because when a laundry girl had spoken, he had listened. Outside, snow covered the road where royal soldiers had once arrived in anger. Inside, Eli opened one eye, saw them beside the shelves, and quietly pulled the blanket over his smile. A crown should never be placed on someone who has not first been given the right to refuse it. Grace said the words in the council chamber, and 30 nobles stopped breathing. 6 months had passed since William first confessed his love between the shelves of the Lantern Quill. In that time, he had not asked her to leave the bookstore. He had not assigned guards to follow her without permission. He had not announced her as his future queen because his son loved her, because the people admired her, or because the court had begun whispering that the Alpha King needed a Luna. Instead, he came every morning. Sometimes he brought royal documents requiring restoration. Sometimes he carried bread. Sometimes he sat in the children's reading room and listened while Grace taught young servants how to recognize false seals, altered ledgers, and military thread. Trust had not returned in one grand moment. It had grown through small ones. Now William stood before the council holding a silver crown. It was lighter than his own. 5 small wolves had been carved around its band, each facing outward rather than toward the throne. The council has approved the title, Lord Bennett said. The people already regard Miss Miller as their queen. The people do not choose for her, William replied. His voice remained calm, but no one mistook calmness for weakness. He descended from the raised platform and stopped several feet from Grace. Eli stood beside the first row of benches, wearing a formal black tunic and trying unsuccessfully to hide his excitement. William did not kneel immediately. He looked at Grace first. I once entered your home believing my fear gave me the right to command the truth, he said. I will not enter your future the same way. The silver crown remained in his hands. I love you. I want you beside me, not because you saved Eli, not because the council requires a Luna, and not because the kingdom wishes to turn your courage into a symbol. Grace heard the quiet rustle of noble robes behind her. William continued, I want you because you challenge every room you enter to become more honest. But the Lantern and Quill is yours. Your title is yours. Your life is yours. If you refuse me, none of those things will be taken from you. Only then did he lower himself to one knee. Grace Miller, will you marry me? She looked at the powerful man kneeling before a bookseller in a blue-gray linen dress. Months ago, his strength had torn shelves from stone. Now that same strength waited without reaching for her. Grace stepped closer. I will not abandon the bookstore. I would never ask it. The public warning law must extend to every territory. It will. Royal records must remain open to the families harmed by Robert Kane. They will. And when I disagree with you before the council, you will not call it disloyalty. A faint warmth entered William's eyes. I expect it will happen often. Eli laughed before covering his mouth. Grace finally smiled. Yes. The wedding took place 1 month later in the courtyard behind the Lantern and Quill. Grace refused the cathedral and its golden pillars. She chose the place where Eli had first appeared beneath the rain, frightened and bleeding, but still holding his wooden wolf. Children filled the front rows. Servants stood beside nobles rather than behind them. Hannah Cole carried the royal records declaring the new protection laws. Nora Bell brought bread from the castle kitchens. Families whose pups had been found through Robert's ledgers placed lanterns along the stone walls. Grace wore a cream medieval gown embroidered with tiny open books and silver wolves. Her honey blonde hair fell in a loose braid decorated with winter flowers. William wore black ceremonial armor without a sword. When the crown was offered, he did not place it on her head. He held it out. Grace took it with both hands and crowned herself. The courtyard erupted in cheers. Later, Eli placed his wooden wolf beside their joined hands. So this means she stays? He asked. Grace bent and kissed his forehead. It means I choose to. Above the bookstore entrance, beneath the law protecting every warning, a second sentence had been carved. Power may offer a place. Only freedom can make it home. William looked at the words, then at Grace. He had once believed love meant protecting what belonged to him. Grace had taught him something harder. To love someone was to protect her right to belong to herself. The ash is wrong. Lily Harper said it quietly, but the entire bookstore heard her. 10 years had passed since Grace Miller crowned herself in the courtyard of the Lantern and Quill. The old shop had grown without losing its shape. Children still read beside the hearth. Merchants still brought ledgers with broken clasps. Servants still entered through the front door rather than waiting beside the kitchen entrance. Above them, the carved law remained visible beneath years of reign. And no warning shall be dismissed because of the speaker's rank. Lily was 17, newly appointed to tend the lamps and braziers during the gathering of 5 alphas. She stood beside the eastern fireplace holding a brass ash shovel. White sparks flickered inside the gray powder. Grace crossed the reading room. What do you smell? Bitter metal, Lily answered. And pine oil, though the wood is oak. Across the room, William stopped speaking with the visiting alphas. He was older now, silver beginning at his temples, but he still carried the broad strength that once tore shelves from stone. He did not order Lily away. He did not ask whether she was certain. He looked toward the guards. Close the doors. Extinguish every brazier. The command moved through the bookstore without panic. Eli, now 18 and nearly as tall as his father, guided the visiting families toward the courtyard. Hannah Cole opened the inspection cabinet. Nora Bell covered the food trays. Grace knelt beside Lily. Inside the ash were thin silver capsules, each small enough to hide beneath charcoal. Heat had begun melting their wax coverings. When opened fully, they would have filled the room with silver smoke. William looked at the brazier, then at Lily. How did you notice? My father burns oak, she said. It never leaves white sparks. A guard entered carrying a struggling servant in a borrowed palace cloak. Beneath his sleeve, they found more capsules and a payment marked with the seal of a rival lord. The attack ended before the first guest began coughing. No shattered windows. No drawn swords. No child hidden behind a wall. Only a young woman who noticed something wrong, and a kingdom trained to listen. That evening, Lily stood before the council. She expected praise. Instead, Grace placed a brass inspection badge in her hand. You will lead the new fire and ventilation staff, the queen said. Lily stared at the badge. I only carried ashes. Grace smiled. Once, I only carried books. After the council departed, William found Grace beneath the oldest surviving shelf. The bloodstained book rested inside a glass case nearby, still open between pages 214 and 215. We were faster this time, he said. We listened sooner. Eli entered with Lily and 3 young servants, already discussing new inspection routes. William watched them gather around Grace's table. Years earlier, one frightened king had destroyed a woman's home because he believed power made his fear more truthful than her warning. Now servants corrected guards. Laundry girls inspected maps. Kitchen maids questioned seals. Booksellers advised kings. Grace reached for William's hand. The victory was not that she had risen from the ruins to a throne. It was that no one in Blackwood territory had to become queen before their warning mattered.